Hi, and welcome back to the Android video series. In this video, I want to talk about binding a service rather than just starting a service. Now, a service is a service. We've already talked about intent services, and there's something else entirely. But if we subclass service, we have the ability to either bind it or just run it. Remember that if we run a service, that we must stop that service if it's not an intent service. And again, I'm not talking about intent services, I'm just talking about services here. So once we start a service, we need to make some provision for stopping the service. The same is true of a bound service. However, in a normal service, it runs and runs and runs and potentially runs and runs and runs and runs. And it's maybe putting things back as extras through an intent. It's doing various things. A bound service, on the other hand, has methods that we can call on from the main activity or whatever started the service, or potentially another application. And we can call on those methods anytime we want. So in contrast to a normal service, which runs, does its job, and then we stop it, a bound service is kind of like an API or a library, a DLL maybe, that kind of sits there until we call on the methods of the service. So in this example, I have a bound service that has one method, and it's just going to add two numbers together. It's a very simple example and, completely contrived. You would never do this in production code. However, let's look at how this happens. Now, this is the main activity. I need something of class bound service, so I'm calling it the service. And I have also a isBound Boolean, and I've set it to false. This is going to tell me if the service is bound. I also have declared a service connection. Now, service connection is something that we use with bound services. There is a class called service connection, and I just create it using a no-arg constructor for service connection, and I've just called that connection. And we're going to use this to see if the connection is bound. I've declared a couple of methods that we're going to come back to. These are activity lifecycle methods that we haven't talked about yet. But when we bind a service, we get two methods, onServiceConnected and onServiceDisconnected. And these are callbacks, and we can handle things. In this case, essentially, we're getting the service in onServiceConnected. We're getting the service as binder.getService, but we haven't looked at binder yet, so this may be a little bit confusing. And then setting the isBound. And then on service disconnection, we're disconnected. We are just resetting isBound. All right, so on create as normal. I am controlling the binding of this service, however, in the onStart and onPause methods. In other words, I want to bind to a service in onStart when the activity comes up, and I want to unbind from the service in onPause when the activity is shutting down, or when the activity is going to an at least partially invisible state. So we remember our activity lifecycle methods, and we see how this is going to work. So now the binding, I'm just going to log out activity started, and then I'm setting up a new intent, and once again, intents, easy. The class we're coming from, the class we're going to. In this case, we are using a bind service method to bind main activity to bound service. And see, here is our bind service method. It accepts three parameters: the intent, as always, the connection, which is that service connection that we declared up here, and the bind auto create. Bound services, I would say 95% of the time we're going to use the constant context.bindAutoCreate. I'm sorry for the tooltip popping up there. But bindAutoCreate, we can see that it's 1, and it's a flag for a bound service that says to automatically create the service as long as the binding exists. So this is what we want to do. On pause, just simply calls unbind service with that connection, and then it sets isBound to false. Now, we didn't set isBound to true up here, so where does that happen? Well, when this bind service is called, we explicitly call it here in onStart, the lifecycle method, onServiceConnected, gets run. When the bound service is unbound, onServiceDisconnected gets run. And there we go. So in here, we set isBound to true, and here we set isBound to false. So now, we use this in order to check to see if we try to call a method of the bound service and it's not bound. That's bad. That's potentially very bad. So we have a method in our bound service called add, but we first must check to see if the service is bound, and that's why we have that Boolean. So there we go. And we just log out the service.add, and here I'm adding 2 and 3, so I should get back 5, right? So everything is fine. We understand, I hope, what is coming from the main activity to get out to the service. At its heart, it's just a service. We have an intent. We're not even passing any extras here. We could, but we're not. So here's our bound service. The key to a bound service is that we have an object called a binder. And a binder binds the service to the activity that set it up. So here we have an iBinder, and it's declared as a new local binder. And this is a typical thing. We could call it myBinder. We could call it anything we want, but it's an inner class that extends, and here's the key, it extends binder. And it gets the service and returns this out of the bound service. So what we have is a bound service returning itself. And this is the way we do this. When a class needs to return itself, it returns itself this. So this is a class variable. So now when the activity comes back, it gets that binder, or when the activity goes out and gets the service, it's getting this out of the service, and that is the binding. Now, what that does is it allows the service to share its methods with the activity. We have an onBind method. Now, we remember from a normal service that we did have an onBind method, and we were just returning null. Here, we're returning the binder. That's all we need to do. We just return the binder. And remember, what's the binder? It's this new local binder that we declared right here. So we return the binder. I'm logging out service and then bound, but we don't have to do that at all. And then here's my add method. And we can see it's just a regular method, normal old method. Doesn't get called from within the bound service at all. It does get called from the activity that binds the service. So again, it adds 2 integers. I passed it a 2 and a 3. It'll return a 5. And that call was done down here in this log statement. So let's see it work. And I want to be looking at my log because there's a lot of important log statements that are coming out. I have activity started, and the service is bound. So it's sitting there waiting, ready for something to happen. When I click add, it says sum is 5. That's great. Now watch what happens in onPause. Oh, I'm not logging out in onPause. That's fine. Okay. Sorry about that. But when the application, and let's go back and get that, service 3, activity started and bound, and again we can add, and then boom. Okay, and if we logged out in on pause, then we would see that log statement. All right, so this is how to bind a service rather than just run a service. But again, with bound services, as in normal services, it is critical that I both start and stop the service. If not, then we get issues, especially with not stopping the service. If you forget to start the service, it just won't work. If you forget to stop the service will still be running by the system. And getting back that service is a little tricky. Now, I should say this. A service will return a single binder no matter what activity binds to it. So we can start a bound service. We can have a bound service started by one activity. And then other activities from this application or other applications can bind to the service if they have the proper intent filters on the bound service. So this is a way to share code between multiple applications potentially, or multiple activities certainly, in our applications. So bound services are extremely useful. They can allow us to share methods across applications, and this of course is extremely useful. So we can factor out useful methods that are common to many applications and use them by starting a bound service in sort of a super activity that runs all these other apps, let's say. Okay, thank you very much.